right, John, thank you so much for doing this interview. I so appreciate it. I know my audience was going to get so much out of this. I'd love to start with an introduction of you. If you could just explain, tell us your name and a little bit about yourself and your profession and what you do every day.
Okay, my name's John Atken. I'm a medical laboratory scientist, which means I'm a mister and not a doctor. 45 years working in diagnostic laboratories in microbiology. Diagnostic laboratories are the places that you send your laboratory tests to be done. So I had a wide experience in working out methods, detecting microorganisms, following emerging infectious diseases, and taking a general interest in the subject of mycobacteriology, which is not the same as microbiology. Mycobacteriology looks at the organisms that are believed to be associated with tuberculosis and with Crohn's disease. Now, medical laboratory scientists as a group are pretty much unheard of. We used to be referred to as vampires or bloodsuckers because the laboratory was known action with patients and as collecting blood for examination, and lab rats is another one, and they all just are a general term for laboratory workers. So right now I have a private company which we've set up in 2012, which researches Crohn's disease and also researches unique biological products that come out of the New Zealand environment and have capacity to have effects on microorganisms. And that too is slanted towards Crohn's disease. So I'm in a unique position for a medical laboratory scientist in that I run my own company.
Yeah, and what led you? You told me a little bit about your journey into this, but if you could share with my audience, what led you into this specific type of research? I think it was your own experience, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, in 1972, I was misdiagnosed as having Crohn's disease, and at that stage, I was in my training in the hospital in microbiology, and there's nothing like a brush with the diagnosis of serious disease to focus you on that particular disease. And I went under that diagnosis for 3 years. I attended the outpatient clinic at Christchurch Hospital, and I was firmly labelled Crohn's disease. And I continued along with that for 3 years, and then I finally thought, I've got Crohn's disease because I'm perfectly normal. So I went to my general practitioner and said, look, I want all the tests repeated. I don't think I've got Crohn's disease. And my GP was a really open-minded sort of a guy, and he booked me up for the tests again, and I had them, and I had to front up to the outpatient clinic at the hospital about 5 days later, and I walked in and the physician said, oh, now how are you going, Mr. Atken? And I said, I don't think I've got Crohn's disease. And he said, what makes you think that? And I said, well, I don't have any symptoms. I've just had the test repeated. And he said, well, we'll soon see about that. And he picked up the phone and he rang up the radiology department in the laboratory, and he put the phone down and said, oh, the tests say that you're completely normal. And I said, oh, thank God. And it was just like this weight lifted off my chest, because one of the things that one of the surgeons who looked at me said was, you have to be very careful because I've worked with Crohn's disease patients in the past, and the gut is very fragile. And I thought, oh no, because at that time I was climbing and I was hiking and doing all those sorts of things, and I thought, I don't want to be in the outback if something goes wrong with me. So it destroyed that part of my life. So I had this tremendous thing go off my shoulders immediately, upon which the physician said, well, I'd still like to see you again in 6 months' time. Well, he never saw me again. I was out of that place.
Yeah.
And so once you are primed to take an interest in a particular disease for personal reasons, you're never thinking about it, you're never reading about it. And so from 1975 on, I was primed to read every article about Crohn's disease. And it was fortuitous that I ended up in a laboratory setting, which was ideal to do work on Crohn's disease. Yeah. Ironically, we did work on Helicobacter pylori first.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm not happy to hear that you had that experience. Of course, that's very unfortunate that you were ill. However, due to your experience with this illness, we're so grateful because of your research has, made huge waves in, the trajectory of so much information that's come to light behind Crohn's disease and, potentially other autoimmune diseases as well. So tell me exactly what your work involves. You believe that there is a very specific bacterium that is correlated to the diagnosis of Crohn's disease. Can you tell me a little bit about that bacteria and what it's called?
Okay, what we believe is happening, and other researchers have described this in the past, is that there are two forms of Mycobacteria. One form has a cell wall, and the other form from the same organism does not have a cell wall. We believe that the forms without cell walls, and of particular Mycobacteria, including Mycobacterium Avium Paratuberculosis, which is called MAP for short, have a role in triggering inflammation in the gut. Now, one thing that you need to understand, which it surprises me, but 95% of the people who work with Crohn's disease do not understand this very simple fact in relation to Mycobacteria, is that there are a number of different types of Mycobacteria. Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes TB. If you have the bacillus from Mycobacterium tuberculosis in your body, you have tuberculosis. The organism can't do anything but cause TB, and it does it beautifully. Now with MAP, it may or may not trigger a disease in you. There are some forms that can, and there are some forms that can't, but the human host is not receptive to these MAP type organisms normally causing disease. But we do know from other work that Crohn's disease sufferers do have mutations in their DNA in their body, and those mutations predispose them to becoming what's described as immunocompromised in terms of these Mycobacteria. So
what percentage of the, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
that's right.
That's a very important point that I want to emphasize, is that there's a genetic mutation happening in this population of people. And what percentage, statistically speaking, do you think of the population is susceptible to this, or who has this genetic mutation which makes them susceptible to the expression of this illness?
It's very difficult to predict that. One fact is that in New Zealand, there are as many Crohn's patients as there are type 1 diabetes patients. So there's a lot of people out there who have Crohn's disease in New Zealand.
I didn't know that.
So if I take it further, there are two players in this game. One is the human host, and the other is the microorganism. Now, the microorganism is constantly evolving. So is it going to become more virulent and cause more disease in people, or is it going to become less virulent? So it's the same question as we're dealing with COVID at the moment.
Yeah. And
we're seeing different strains coming out, some of which are more contagious. That will be happening with MAP. So, so it's unpredictable at the moment.
Right.
The reason it's predictable, there has not been enough study done on the organisms, and there hasn't been enough study done on the organisms because people have not practiced fundamental science and isolated the organism and studied it. They've gone in all other directions. They've used different therapies on the assumption that they're actually dealing with an autoimmune disease. It's disorganized.
Very, extremely. And that leads me to, could you explain to my audience, what is a zoonotic disease, if I'm pronouncing it correctly?
Right.
And how are humans contracting this illness, which leads to, please explain to them what is zoonotic. Am I pronouncing that right? Zoonotic.
Yes.
Okay,
zoonotic,
good.
Yeah. Yeah. A zoonotic disease is a disease that comes from the different species, avium, which causes a lung disease in some patients.
You said it comes from animals, correct?
Yes, it comes from animals. And to give you an example, elderly patients get a lung disease which is caused by Mycobacterium avium. Mycobacterium avium comes from birds. In the case of, and we know that because that's why we call it Mycobacterium avium.
Avium, yes.
So it's not uncommon to have diseases go from animals to humans. It becomes more common when we change our practices for raising food or handling water. All of these other factors bring us more into contact with these organisms, which in general are called opportunistic. So if they see an opportunity, they'll be in. And sometimes it takes them a while to make that huge jump. It's like crossing the Atlantic. You have to make a lot of effort to cross the Atlantic. And over the years, it becomes simpler to cross the Atlantic. But in the initial stages, it's very, very difficult. And this is what a zoonosis is. It initially has difficulty going to the human host, but if you put the host together with the organism, sooner or later, it will happen.
They'll find
the organism will find the right PIN number to hop over into the human, and then you have trouble.
Yes. And you specifically see this coming from cows, correct? I know it goes a little bit beyond that, but typically cows.
Yeah, I think the organism is coming from the food chain. I'll be specific about that. And there is a high likelihood based on other research that the MAP organism we see in humans is linked to the MAP organism that causes a disease called Johne's disease in cattle. The problem is they're not exactly the same. And they're not exactly the same because the one that causes the disease in livestock has a cell wall. The one that we're seeing in humans doesn't. So it's changed its appearance and its ability to live in the human. So it's not exactly the same, but you know, it's
symptomatically it expresses itself in very similar ways, correct?
Yes, with one important exception, and that's that you do not see the cell-walled versions of MAP in the human gut, but you do see it in the animal gut. So the jury's still out. How do you resolve that problem? You resolve it by taking the organism from humans and by putting it into animals. So you have to take exactly the same cell, exactly the same organism without a cell wall, isolated from the tissue of a Crohn's disease patient, and you have to put it into an animal. And we've done that as a pilot. And I have to say the results were very, very encouraging. And then COVID came along, another zoonotic disease, and we had to pause that study, but we're resuming it soon.
Oh, good. And so
I think that there are, so you know, just well, it's what people need. The clinicians need evidence. they're not gonna move unless they see something and unless they understand it. So
yeah,
so
I just myself got a new gastroenterologist 2 weeks ago because I moved, and I presented him with my ebook that I wrote on this very subject, and he more or less rolled his eyes and threw it on the table. And so it's really.
well, you can't totally blame the clinician, because if the clinician has not been presented with evidence that they can understand, then they will not believe it because they haven't seen it for themselves.
Right. I even took him the packet that you can print from, humanpara.org that does present some of the evidence. But, some people, some medical professionals, it just doesn't seem to matter how much, evidence you give them. If they didn't learn it in medical school, then it's just not on their agenda.
I think I'd put it another way. It has to be simple. It has to be simple because, a person like me can speak 2 languages. I can speak the language I speak when I go down to the hotel at night and have a few beers, and I can speak the language I talk in the laboratory. The 2 are not the same. So to explain something to somebody, it has to be very simple. And so I think that that's important, and you can't blame clinicians for not understanding the minute stuff that comes out of the laboratory. It has to be presented simply. And our first paper, which is coming out in a couple of weeks, addresses that problem by simply explaining the appearance of the organism in the tissue from patients, so that people can see it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The simplicity is where it's at. Let's get even more specific. So you're saying it's in the food chain, specifically cows. Johne's disease looks very similar to Crohn's disease, if not identical, symptomatically anyway. We know the cells, one has a cell wall, one doesn't. What percentage, so there's infected cows. Obviously not every cow is infected with this bacteria and wasting away. What percentage of cattle do you find is infected with this bacteria? And obviously it's probably different and varies country to country, I would assume.
Okay, New Zealand has done a lot of work on that, and it's estimated that the herds, in other words, the entire group of organisms, entire group of cattle or sheep on any one farm, that constitutes one herd. Yes. Then 60% of the herds in New Zealand are carrying the organism that causes Johne's disease.
60%.
60%.
Wow.
And that's probably not much different from others. It depends solely on the number of animals that are infected. That relates to the chances of you possibly getting the disease. Yeah. But again, you have to look at the circumstantial evidence and not the specific evidence for the link. And one of the interesting things is that patients with Crohn's disease who develop Crohn's disease get it in the gut, and that indicates that it is probably foodborne. So it goes into your digestive system, it's picked up in the gut, and the gut is where things start to happen. Now, there's a very similar disease in the lungs in humans, which is caused by another member of the Mycobacterium group, Mycobacterium Avium complex, in which the patient who gets the lung disease sarcoidosis also displays very similar symptoms to the patient with Crohn's disease, except that it occurs in the lung. And the organisms that are associated with that are airborne. So the patient who has sarcoidosis, they may well pick it up from the shower, or they may well pick it up from aerosols, not foodborne.
Wow.
So different organisms coming from different places. The immune system is primed to jump in at the first sign of an organism. So if it's aerosol, you'll get the action round there. If it's in the gut, the action will be in the mesenteric nodes. But there is at the moment no direct evidence to confirm that, except that we are now publishing. I've been sort of 5 years thinking, oh, you know, will I, won't I, and I've resisted the pressure to publish because I felt that unless it was simple and unless my colleagues on the laboratory bench could do it, then there was no point in publishing it because it would be too complicated. And if you read a lot of the Crohn's papers, they are very complicated and they're not something that will transfer easily to the routine laboratory bench. So nothing happens. I
see. Well, I'm happy to hear that you are soon to be publishing because I feel like that is progress, you know, in this area. So selfishly, I'm really happy to hear that.
I'm hoping they're going to be interesting papers to read.
Okay.
Okay.
So this bacteria is very, very hard to kill. It's it's from my understanding, which is, you know, I'm not a scientist. From my understanding, it's very, very different than your average bacteria. Hence, it's very hard to kill. The MDs in this country or and abroad who are aware that Crohn's disease may potentially be infectious or an infection, they treat it with a triple antibiotic therapy. So we're talking 3 different antibiotics for like a minimum of 2 years. Often patients stay on these antibiotics for 4 years. I know a woman who's been on them for 6 years, and that may sound crazy, you know, for us to even wrap our heads around being on antibiotics for so long. And as an alternative practitioner, you know, I do have concerns about, you know, the microbiome, you know, on these very powerful drugs for so long, and not just 1, but 3. But I'd like to address that because just the fact that that is the therapy, I personally don't know, you know, of you know, maybe TB and other very serious illnesses, but there's not many diseases out there where the therapy is 3 different antibiotics for years. Which, you know, is a testimony in and of itself, the magnitude of the bacteria that we're dealing with. Can you just tell me a little bit about how different this bacteria seems to be? I do know that it survives, you know, extreme heat and pasteurization and chlorination and all these things, and that fascinates me. Can you just touch on that?
I think in many ways, this organism has evolved to do all the things that you describe. Now, in the tissue in Crohn's disease, the organism doesn't divide very much, and so it doesn't replicate. What it does is, if you imagine it's like a car, it sits in the car garage with the engine running, but it doesn't go anywhere. So in that sort of situation, what happens to the organism is a lot of its functions that are related to replication and multiplication aren't switched on. Antibiotics require the functions to be on because they work quickly. But because the car engine is still running and the organism is metabolizing, the antibiotics will work, but only over a much longer time. Now, in the case of tuberculosis, a 6-month therapy is standard for TB if you get TB. If you get multiply drug-resistant TB, you may be on it for a very long time, a lot longer than 6 months, because these organisms don't replicate at the same speed that E. coli does or something like that. They all replicate slower, but they don't replicate very much at all if they don't have cell walls, and they're in what is called the dormant state. Mm-hmm. They just lie there and produce the results of their metabolism into the environment, and that's what causes the inflammation, we believe. So that's one aspect. To look at it perhaps in a way that is more relevant to the patients. The reason why things have not progressed much more rapidly in terms of therapies is because the vast pharmaceutical and diagnostic complexes in the world do not believe it's an infection. So they don't put many resources into it. Right. So you guys and us are left in a situation where we've got to work together and say, okay, these are the reasons why you should be thinking about this as an infection. And once you think about it as an infection, you can slowly turn the argument round to focus more and more researchers on the question of what the hell is going on in Crohn's disease.
Yeah.
To do that, the job is done.
Okay. Yeah. And you know, that brings me to, you know, testing, because it is such a, you know, obscure infection. How does one get tested for this bacteria? You know,
okay.
there are labs, I know there are labs in the US that are claiming to test for MAP. And I've had, you know, many people email me and contact me over the years saying, oh, I read your book, but I tested negative for MAP and I don't have it. And they're getting tested in these labs here, which are, you know, by far inferior to, you know, the testing is inferior to what you're doing. It's just not accurate. Why is the testing different? And why are you, why is your lab, tell me the name of your lab and why is it the only lab in the world so far that's actually accurately testing for this bacteria?
I don't know the answer to why we're the only ones doing it. I suspect that it's a bit like being able to do something that works, but not being able to get other people to understand what you're doing. The first problem, and there's a recent paper out by Todd Kunstner and his group that tested patients and normal controls for MAP, and they found MAP everywhere. And the reason for that is that MAP is in the environment, and the normal person will also come into contact with MAP and pick it up and carry it. If there's MAP in the milk, there will be MAP in your feces, even if you're normal. But the normal person will be able to stop the invasion into the lymph nodes and those sort of places. The Crohn's patient can't. So if you do a test for MAP, it doesn't mean anything. And any person who is told you're positive for MAP, you have the MAP DNA, if they take that along to the clinician will point to Todd's paper and a number of other papers, one by Just et al., which found more MAP in normal controls than they found in Crohn's patients, and say, okay, you're telling me that you have got MAP. How does that make me diagnose you Crohn's disease? Because all these normal people have it. So that's the big problem. Nobody, or very few people understand that MAP is an pathogen. It doesn't have to cause infection. It only causes infection in those patients who have got the genetic susceptibility. So a number of the tests that are done are based on MAP positive, MAP negative. That is societal idiocy on a global scale, because it's not going to tell the clinician anything about the disease. You have to look for the organism, and our work has been based on the assumption that there are two different variants of the MAP type organisms. One is normally carried by patients and they get rid of it very quickly, so it doesn't have the same worn, evolving look to it as those that occur in Crohn's patients. Because in a Crohn's patient, that organism's going to have been sitting inside you for a while. So it will have developed defense mechanisms against the immune system that are plainly visible. And so it's a different organism than the ones the normal patient carries. So you have to actually see the organism. When you can see the organism, you can grow the organism.
It's a different strain these places are detecting. Is that correct? It's a different strain in the cluster of the Mycobacterium organisms?
I avoid the term strain, but there was a researcher in the 1960s who described them as forms. He said there's form 1 and there's form 2. I would say that probably we're all carrying the form 2 organism.
Okay.
But the form 2 organism evolves further. So we're the variant form. And it's a variant because it is not what we see in normal patients. We only see it in Crohn's patients. And the recent work on tissue is quite explicit. You can see the variant form in the bowel tissue of Crohn's patients. So that's like saying, this is what I'm looking for gold. This is what gold looks like. I know what it looks like because I can see it in the tissue. I wonder if it's also in the blood. And lo and behold, it is. And once you see it, you can say, so that's what it looks like. Oh, look, it does that, it does this, it does the other thing. And then when you grow it, you can see if those factors are mapped in the DNA of the variant form of the organism. And that's what we're doing right now.
What is the name of your lab and where they can find that information?
Yeah. The name of the lab, the first word is a Maori word, which is Aotearoa. That is translated as the place of playing games. And it's a very old word, and it is the Maori name for the river that went past the hospital where we all trained in, which is called the Aotearoa Avium River. And so New Zealand is bicultural, so we have 2 languages. So it was, and the Maoris called it Aotearoa because they took the kids down there to play in the river. So it was a place of playing games. And then we wanted a European word, so we chose pathways because we wanted to signal to the Maori that we were working with, that we were working in partnership with them on the discovery of new antibiotics, so that they would also benefit from what we were doing. So the name is Aotearoa Pathways. And that site is going to become a little more active very soon because the publications will be posted on that site. And also we're using it to order the tests that we do.
Yes, yeah, okay. And I will put the name of the lab and a link to that in the description of the video. I think this is a good time to sort of share an example of the lab work that your company, produces. I myself got tested for MAP. I would like to share my personal example of my labs with everyone. You personally were the scientist behind this lab work. And I think it's really important to point out to my audience that my diagnosis is ulcerative colitis, proctitis. And, that's really interesting to me because, my test was very positive for MAP, and treating my condition as an infection has greatly improved, my condition. And so I think it's just important to share this. So I'm going to do that. Let me see how I can do this really quickly.
Well, while you're putting it up, I'll just talk a little about that.
Please.
There are 2 main diagnoses of inflammatory bowel disease: Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Between the 2, there is a very big grey area. And so some ulcerative colitis may subsequently develop Crohn's, some Crohn's may actually be ulcerative colitis. because the cause is not understood. So people are defining the disease based on symptoms. So clinicians, when they talk about ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, it's not always a specific diagnosis. Again, not their fault, because nobody knows exactly what causes Crohn's disease. In the medical textbooks, it is poorly understood, or that the cause is unknown. So really IBD, not so much Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, though there are differences.
See, tell me, I think I would be doing a disservice to people if I didn't have you address to my audience that Mycobacterium, the bacterium that we've been discussing, is not just being associated with IBD, with colitis and or Crohn's, or I'm sorry, Crohn's and maybe colitis. It's also, there's been research associating it with some other conditions and some other illnesses. Can you share with us what those other conditions are? Just briefly touch on those, just so my audience is aware.
Right. There's a family of organisms that you'd almost describe as a gang. And they are Mycobacterium Avium complex. And they're all opportunistic mycobacterial infections. And it includes MAP, and there are a number of others as well. So when we started doing this, I concentrated specifically on Crohn's disease, because I believed, and I still believe, that that is the most difficult one to work with. The line when you've done work with disease. Sarcoidosis is a disease that we are starting to work on now. We've looked at rheumatoid arthritis with interesting signs in the first instance, and we've looked at other diseases associated with autoimmune diseases, but not enough to draw a conclusion. But I would say that the humans are susceptible to these organisms, depending on how well their immune system is functioning. And so you could go along for the rest of your life and have no problems whatsoever until you came into contact with that organism, and then you would develop a disease. And the more organisms of this type there are out there in the food chain and in the environment, the more likely you are to develop a condition with them. That's the theory. And I do personally believe, from what we're seeing at the moment, that this organism is much more widespread than just Crohn's disease. Well, that's no comfort. That's no comfort.
Yeah, it's not comforting at all. That reminds me of the website, though, and of humanpara.org, which I know you're familiar with. Do you have any association with humanpara.org? And if so, can you talk about that organ? I'm not sure if you do, or I honestly don't know myself.
Yeah, I'm associated with it because some of the people on the site were treated with anti-MAP therapy, and I've been invited to several of their conferences and have spoken at them. And I've done that because I fundamentally believe that the 20th century of the doctor, and it was one in which science was moving at a breakneck pace. Because of the internet, and because of the fact that you and I can correspond directly like this, then the 21st century is the century of the patient. So people like me must get out there and talk directly to the people who are affected. There's always a rightful owner of the song, and the rightful owner of the song in this case is the patient.
Yeah, I like that. And so the Human Para, that organization, they meet in Berkeley, I believe, once a year, and MDs and researchers from all over the globe go to that conference annually to discuss the latest findings and the most up-to-date research regarding the MAP bacteria in relationship to Crohn's disease and and these other illnesses, but I think mostly Crohn's. Is that correct?
Yes, and the patients are invited as well. And that's the part that I think is the most valuable. I think the ability to discuss the findings with patients in a collective group, and also individually in the breaks and things like that, is really, really important, because each patient that you talk to will talk to another 20 patients about what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
And so people start to think, okay, we've got to start putting pressure on about this. So that's the important thing. The researchers, generally speaking, with the exception of me, tend to publish quite regularly. They don't have a very good idea of what we do. So it's an opportunity for me to talk about our work to researchers as well. But that's all going to go to publications from now on, now that I'm confident about what we're doing.
That's great.
So, but it's very important collectively to meet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I myself would I am going to try to attend the next annual conference in Berkeley. And so if you're there, you know, who knows, maybe someday I'll get to meet you face to face. You know, I would love to go. I think it would be an incredible experience. And so I will also put humanpara.org's link in the description so that people can look at that organization and what they're doing, because it is a nonprofit organization of MDs and scientists that are trying to spread awareness and information around Crohn's being, you know, I should say potentially being an infectious disease rather than an autoimmune disease. Not that the immune system isn't involved, of course it is, but that it's not as straightforward and black and white as just an autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
So let's see. So we touched on the other illnesses and those other diseases that are linked to the Mycobacterium Avium Paratuberculosis. Those are listed and briefly touched on the humanpara.org site. If you're interested in those other, I know leprosy is one of those conditions that humanpara.org is talking about, as well as MS, multiple sclerosis, and diabetes. And so the research that they're doing around those conditions as well is really interesting. You know, to go back to, I want to touch on a little bit more about the Mycobacteria in the dairy supply, and you know, almost not to get too political, but why do you think it is that there's this really nasty bacteria in the dairy supply that is really destroying a small percentage, or maybe not a small percentage, a significant percentage of humans in their health? And these are devastating conditions. Why do you think that these countries, well, I should say, why do you think the US is not taking more responsibility? And that would lead me to then, that's part one of the question. I know that there are countries that are paying more attention to this issue. Can you talk about the countries that are paying more attention to this issue and what exactly they're doing?
Well, if we assume that the organism is foodborne and that it's coming from the food supply, and if we again assume that dairy plays a big part in it, or a part in it, then there is certainly evidence that MAP survives pasteurization at the normal pasteurization temperatures. So the simplest way to stop this from happening is to change the pasteurization temperatures of milk. And this is what the UK has already done. They increase the pasteurization time of standard. So there are simple ways to tackle these problems. And And the UK did it on a principle called the precautionary principle. They said, we don't need to have specific evidence. We just need to act on the evidence that we have at the moment. So that's what they went and did. And in terms of the mentality of industry, it's like smoking. You know, cigarettes were really good for you in the 1940s and in the 1950s, and then evidence started gathering that they triggered lung cancer. And from then on, it's been a long road for reformers to change the attitude of towards the product. So industry in those sort of cases is reactive. So if something comes up, they will manage a way through it because they want to keep the industry going. I mean, large industries related to the food industry don't actually like change. You know, Coca-Cola has had a very similar formula for decades. They tried to change it in the 1980s or the 1970s. It didn't work. So they went back to the old formula. So there's something about stability that makes people comfortable. So industry, it's very difficult for them to change, and very often when they change, it doesn't always work. So there's resistance to change.
Not to mention, I think it would, you know, it would be probably rather expensive to change, you know, the best practices around, you know, how they handle cattle. I did touch on the precautionary principle in my ebook and e-report, and I did elaborate on that quite a bit in my book, because I think that that's a really important point. But I just find it very unfortunate that you know, most countries, including the US, won't, you know, take a stance and make this very, you know, needed and necessary change. It's very disheartening, and I do know that our dairy industry here in the US is very much linked to you know, the political world, and so those connections and those ties are very strong. And
it's international. It is international, but I'll go back to a very simple thing. Someone once observed to me that that human nature is such that it doesn't like to be told to change their way. And he said, you know, there's an old, if you're going to rebuke a sinner, do it gently. So just explain to people maybe they should reform on the basis of these problems. But you have to do it nicely.
Yeah, right. I can't remember where I read this, and so maybe I dreamt it up, you tell me, but I read somewhere that there's a country or several countries where if you go to the grocery store, you know, just like in grocery stores, you can now buy, you know, certified organic food, that in some countries you can actually go buy certified MAP-free, you know, meat and dairy. Is that true? Is New Zealand one of those countries?
No, we're definitely not one of those countries.
All right.
Probably the one that would spring to mind, if it's going to happen anywhere, it will happen in Japan.
I was going to say it's either Japan or the Netherlands or Australia, one of those. Yeah.
No, not Australia. I remember Professor Momatami is a Crohn's researcher. I remember him speaking on it once, and he was quite explicit. He said that if it is proven that MAP is linked to Crohn's disease, then the trade barriers will go up. And this was the Japanese view. So, you know, it's impossible to stop this now. I think that industry must think about dealing with what is going to take place, and they need to do it in a proactive way.
And how do you feel the next, you know, 5 to 10 years? What do you think that looks like with your work, you know, really coming to fruition, and the things that you're doing and about to do? What do you think the next 5 to 10 years will bring?
I think that having identified methods where we can actually see the organism that are quite simple, then that creates a whole new ball game. You know, sometimes it's very difficult to convince one person, but if you convince 20 people, they are all going to go out there and talk about it. The medical laboratories work the same way. You know, a good example is the story of Helicobacter pylori with Barry Marshall,
Yes.
and an unnamed medical laboratory scientist who was working with him. Marshall a cocktail of Helicobacter pylori, and he got gastritis, and then he treated himself with it with antibiotics. Now, I think that one of the reasons why that went viral all of a sudden, or pre-viral, was because of the story of him chugging down the organism. So, so sometimes if you can put something out there quite simply, then there is engagement internationally very quickly if it's simple. I mean, not that everybody went out there chugging down gastritis, but they all went out there looking at his methods and looking at culture methods, and it all happened very quickly. But it has to be simple. And so I think we are on the cusp of that. I believe that is going to happen.
This may be a question out of your wheelhouse, but given that the therapy is 3 different antibiotics, and sometimes they change out, they took out Cipro, years ago because of the side effects, and they replaced it with something. Do you foresee any possibility of them, creating a drug, like a single antibiotic or other antibiotics that would be able to target MAP more efficiently than the antibiotics that currently exist?
Well, if you look at COVID, if you go back in your head 2.5 years ago, everything was absolutely normal. There were no problems. 2.5 years later, we actually understand the organism. There are potential therapies. Most importantly, there are vaccines that can do something about it. In 2.5 years, and we're still going around this endless track, this endless circle that everybody's going around in, and it's because there are not enough people joining the discussion and advancing it. Once you have a target, then the therapies will follow. And I firmly believe that there will be new and much better therapies once everyone gets their act together, switches off the television, and sits down and really gets onto this like they did with COVID-19.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's encouraging. Anyway, that's encouraging. Let's hope. Because the drug therapy that they have right now is far from perfect, but it's what we have. And myself as an alternative practitioner, there was a study done. There are several natural compounds that have been proven to be effective against the MAP bacteria. I don't know if you're aware. I can send you those studies, but they have shown that oregano oil of oregano actually does kill the MAP bacteria. And cinnamon oil, but these oils are so abrasive that sometimes they can even be more detrimental in treatment to the body than even the antibiotics. They can just cause a lot of pain and cramping, and so they're not always realistic as far as treatment goes. So it's I think it's I hope that that awareness does spread in the scientific community so that they don't stop seeking potential new treatments, because they're definitely needed. Not everybody does well on the triple antibiotics. Some people respond fabulously, which is amazing.
It's already happening. Human Health Foundation is funding between Otakaroa Pathways and Johns Hopkins to look at these organisms and to challenge them at Johns Hopkins with different compounds, alternative ones, and antibiotics, to see if there are new compounds that are out there. That is already happening, and that is happening because we can isolate the organism.
That's great.
If you don't have the organism, you can't find out whether it's sensitive or resistant to antibiotics. So it's already happening. You know,
well, that's wonderful. I was unaware. That's great news.
It's a quiet revolution. It's happening already.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I don't know, are they sharing that information on Human Para at all, or on
they have mentioned that the study's due to start, and the results will most definitely be published.
Okay, that's fantastic. And you said something important about the vaccine. You touched on the vaccine, and I was wondering if you had any knowledge because there is a vaccine now for Crohn's disease. Are you involved with any of that? Can you share a little bit of that at least?
I'm not involved with it, and I'm interested to see the results of the current trial that they're doing. I would hope that it works, but the bizarre thing is that if you are an infant, if you are very, very, very young, the first thing that will happen with your immune system is it will pick up Mycobacteria from the environment, and it will start a natural vaccination process. And that vaccination process in the human body is ongoing. So I have some difficulties understanding how the vaccines that are being promoted will work in relation to this process that goes on naturally.
Okay.
And we're writing on that at the moment. It's a very interesting subject.
Yeah.
But I mean, those sort of things are very worthy, and the questions need to be answered. But I think one of the problems with the whole field of research is that people rushed in and they used PCR, but not enough people actually down and worked with the organism and isolated it. And the reason for that is there are not a lot of people trained like I am, and a few others were trained to do things in a disciplined way, to work out a medium that allows for the organism to be grown, to grow the organism, to test it, and then to conclude that it is causing disease. The only other person I know of who did this was Rod Cialdini in 1984 to 1990, and that was the right way to go.
And so you're saying that researchers and they were aware even then. I mean, you're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. There were researchers that were
aware. No, this was the 1980s. This was in the late 1880s.
I'm sorry.
It was known. Yeah,
I misheard you.
It was known in the late 1880s that there were different forms of Mycobacteria present.
Okay.
But somehow or other, there were mistakes made in the laboratories from that time on that that neglected the form 2 Mycobacteria. But it was known in the very early days. Nothing is new in microbiology.
Right. And well, Dr. Crohn himself, right? I mean, Dr. Crohn himself was confident that this disease was infectious when this disease was coined and given this, this label, but he couldn't prove it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that there are two broad tumors. One that it's an autoimmune disease, and the other is that it's an infectious disease. And within those two groups, it goes into: is it caused by the diet? Is it caused by the fecal microbiome? Is it caused by a particular organism? And then the autoimmune area is: what is the autoimmune dysfunction that occurs that causes the disease? So been going in two directions. It's coming together again.
Yeah, that's great. Here is my personal lab from
Okay, I've got it here. Yeah, I've got it here.
2018. You can see it. Okay.
Okay, I'll explain the first bit. The page 1, you can see at the top 8-day and 30-day. So there are numbers in a column going down, and there are 5. We were trying 5 different media at that time. One of them, media E, was a substance that we suspected inhibited the organism. So what I want you to do is look at the first column on the 8 days, which says percentage large, and it goes 2, 6, 1, 2, 5, and then move to the 30-day, 15, 26, 17, 18, and 5. And that shows that from 8 days to 30 days, the large forms have grown enormously. There's a lot there on the 30-day. So we instituted that for 2 reasons. One was that in media E, we had demonstrated that particular compound was inhibitory to the organism because it hasn't done much between the 2 periods, and the others show definite growth. So for a clinician, what they want is they want evidence that the organism is growing, that it's not just a figment of John Atken's imagination that these organisms exist. They actually grow. So that's that bit.
And then let's see. Can you comment just on the difference between the persister forms, the daughter cells, the ruptured forms, etc.?
Well, I think the persister forms are known as dormant forms or latent forms. They occur in patients with Crohn's disease, and it tells us that we haven't been able to get them all to grow because they're still dormant. But really, in most cases, we get growth quite easily. So the persister forms are how they would normally occur in your body without being motivated to grow. Daughter cells are interesting, and mother and daughter cells are interesting because they are well described as a feature of the cell wall deficient Mycobacteria in a way that they replicate. Ruptured forms are really interesting. We thought at first that they were waking up and dying, but what we found is they're actually an evolving growth mechanism by which the organism expands, but it also deposits lipids around the inside of its cell membrane. Large forms are the ones we most often see in ulcerative colitis, but we also see it in in Crohn's disease as well. Now I've come to the conclusion that these organisms are growing and that they conform to what we believe Crohn's disease organisms or the variant forms look like. I see in this that we weren't at that stage using the term variant forms, but I was talking about the 7DN broth. And the 7DN broth, moderate numbers of free organisms. So in other words, we've shaken the white cells and we've got the organisms out of the white cells and they're growing well, which is what the variant forms do. Okay.
And there's some images here.
Yeah, the images are showing what we term the large forms that are both attached to the white cell on the red arrows at the first picture and are also free in the medium. The second photograph shows a persister form sitting inside a white cell and getting rather fat. Those are similar to the organisms that we see in the bowel, the persister forms.
And there's another one.
Oh yeah, this is interesting because what you can see in there, the small spots, are actually lipid depositions being made by the organism, sort of like saving up lipids for going to multiply.
Hmm.
And then this one here, the bilaterally dividing cells that are arrowed, the organism is dividing, and it's also, they're also the variant forms. There's no doubt of that.
Hmm.
There you'll see here the thickened wall on the outside of that large circle in the middle. That is very, very characteristic of a form that is growing and depositing lipids.
Hmm.
So
And
that's where we were then. Now we're at the stage of working a lot more on the variant forms and working a lot more on the PCR.
And so
and
that's amazing that it's even since 2018 that it's evolved and so much, you know, with your work. It just, you know, is testimony of how far, you know, that every 5 years or every few years we're just going to keep, you know, evolving in this world, which is so exciting. Now, looking at this test, knowing that my diagnosis is ulcerative colitis, you know, you do say at the end of this, where is it? I think you said the overall appearances are similar to these seen in IBD, where the patient may be on suboptimal therapies. The low numbers of large forms in each cluster suggest ulcerative colitis. But the 7DN broth, however, shows moderate numbers of free organisms, which we commonly see in Crohn's disease. So what would you say about?
Oh, okay. Firstly, one of the things is that if you look at the history of tuberculosis before the cause was discovered, you would get TB meningitis. You would get growth on the skin, in the lung, in most organs, and in the bowel, and they were all described as different diseases. Once the organism is isolated, they realized that they were all caused by tuberculosis and they were all essentially the same disease. And I think that's where we're now moving towards. We can see these appearances that we do see with ulcerative colitis, and also appearances that we associate with Crohn's disease. And it really indicates that it's an inflammatory bowel disease picture. It's both of those pictures are seen in Crohn's disease and in ulcerative colitis. So it's an IBD picture. If you look at what that actually means to I guess somebody who's working in the area, it means that you should be responsive to a therapy against the organism. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, from mesalazine right through to azathioprine, those are all therapies used for Crohn's disease, but they have all been shown by Greenstein et al. That they have anti-MAP activity.
Wow, even
only we think that we're treating inflammation, which we probably are.
You're saying mesalazine?
Yeah, they're all
mesalazine.
Yeah, mesalazine's derived from a sulfur drug.
Yeah.
So you know, that's what happens when you don't know what causes it. When you know what causes it, all of these things can be explained in terms of the organism.
Wow.
But until that's worked out, there are problems. Once you explain how the organism is involved in causing inflammation, a light bulb goes on across the medical world. That's my hope, that people will suddenly sit up and think, hey, maybe we should look at what's going on in the Crohn's world with the researchers who are working with MAP.
Right.
But the problem, I guess, at that point there, is that I'm describing an organism which nobody who is going to read the report has ever seen. And therefore, there's a failure to communicate on behalf of the scientists and explaining what we're doing and what we're actually finding.
Yeah.
And it's moved now to the point where the really serious work has to start, and the serious work can be done very quickly. I'll just point out too, we were back at that stage on this first page here. as I said before, media E was a compound that we believed would inhibit MAP, and there it was doing it. So even back there, we were methods that we could use to establish whether the organism was sensitive or resistant to certain antibiotics.
That's what media E what is?
Yeah, well, if you look at media E and you run your eye along them, you've got 5 and 5 on the large on both sides. And then you move up to any one of the others and do the same thing. You go, the control, you go 2 to 15, media B 2 to 26, 1 to 17, 2 to 18, 5 to 5. That organism is not growing. The others are.
What were you using for this?
I can't remember.
Oh no!
I can go back and look because we document all of those things.
Well, I would absolutely love to know. I guess the more important question is, what are you using for a media E type thing now? Currently, what are you using?
We're not. We've discontinued media E because we've been working on toughening up the other media, because what the other media are telling us is those additives are causing the organism to grow, and that's what we want. So if you imagine we take the compounds that are in those and put them into one single media, then we get really, really, really good growth.
I see. Okay.
And that's where we are now. We've sort of done all of that work, and we know that we have a media which we can grow the organisms with confidence.
And so, as far as, I'm just curious, as far as my numbers go, you know, with the large, would you say that these are higher numbers than you usually see? Average numbers, similar to what you typically see?
If I look at those now, I would say that your IBD in an acute phase of the illness, as you know, things are happening in there. If the figures were a lot less, I'd say, yeah, maybe you're on suboptimal therapy, or whatever you're on is not working very well, but it's going okay. So it's a matter of sitting down and knowing what's going on in the patient, and then relating it to what we see in the organism's behavior. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for breaking that down the labs. I think that that's going to really be beneficial, you know, to my audience, for them to just really see in black and white, you know, the work that you're doing, and the evidence. Let's see, I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'm just going to ask you 2 more questions. I won't steal up too much more of your time. But one thing that we both wanted to touch on is, where does diet play a role in these illnesses?
Diet is the elephant in the room. We know that Crohn's patients in particular can get into remission by the use of diets. But maddeningly, we don't know what they actually use, because when you're in remission, you just want to forget about anything that went on beforehand, and you don't want to discuss what you're on, because you just want to put Crohn's into the back of your head and stay on what you're on, and in terms of your diet changes. There are things that are not good, and there are publications to support that. One example is high density lipids like cholesterol. There is ample evidence on the fringes to show that high cholesterol makes it, you will have less remissions if your cholesterol is high. And the reason that was found was because in mega studies of patients, they found that patients who were on statins to lower the cholesterol level actually had far less remissions than patients who weren't on statins. And that led to a lot of frenzied discussion in the gastroenterology world about why that was. But that observation has stuck. And interestingly, when a patient goes into a flare-up, their cholesterol level drops significantly. And our argument is that something is using that cholesterol to replicate or something. You know, that's a bug effect that's happening there. So diet, anecdotally, plays a part. There's some very interesting studies from the Japanese pointing out that certain diets will result in less in more remissions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's intriguing, and most Crohn's research clinics have a dietitian attached to them now. So we know that diet plays a part. It's just that it's not out there, and people monitor their diet because they can't monitor anything else.
Yeah, it plays a huge part, and I talk a lot about that on my website, and a lot of my work with patients revolves entirely around diet. And sometimes we can achieve remission just with diet with some patients, not all, but a small percentage just with diet alone can gain remission, which is incredible. And so it is an important point to to make. So I appreciate your insight into that. A lot of the scientists and even the MDs. I remember when I was first diagnosed at 15, I asked him about diet when I was 15, my first gastroenterologist, and he said, just stay away from pizza and popcorn. That's all he said. I'll never forget. I'll never forget. He said, just stay away from pizza and popcorn. And it's interesting because even at 15 years old, I was 15, there was just something in me, John, that knew it wasn't just autoimmune. Now, I didn't even have an understanding quite yet of what autoimmune was. But at 15 years old, I felt like I had an infection. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't tell my doctor that. It didn't make sense to my mother. I don't know what it was in me inherently that knew. And we're talking, I'm sharing my age, but we're talking 25 years ago. I just knew at 15 years old. This was way before anything. Well, it existed, as you know, this information existed, but it wasn't, easily accessible, we'll say that. And so, even at 15, I, got on very strict diets and made a lot of progress. So, the diet is key for sure.
I have a private joke about infection and inflammation, and it's as easy as ABC, anything but Crohn's.
Yeah, I have one more question for you. Last question. There's a lot of people out there still suffering immensely with these illnesses, and I can't express my gratitude enough for your work and what you do and what you're bringing to this, the IBD community. It's just, the trajectory of your work is just going to, really, you're leaving a legacy, honestly, you're leaving a legacy. If you had one, message to those still suffering through these, devastating conditions, I want to say from your heart, if you had one message, taking off your scientific, hat, what would your message be? Because we know what your message is scientifically, but just from a human standpoint, what is your message to those still suffering?
Scientifically, my feeling is that I'm a cautious optimist. If I take it to a personal level, based on what we've done in science, the message is very simple. It's that change is certain. It's absolutely certain that what is happening at the moment is going to influence the Crohn's disease as an autoimmune disease. That's the first thing. The second thing is change is coming. The change is certain and change is coming.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Change, you know, the only thing constant is change, right? That's it.
Yep.
So that's really, I love that. That's really important. And you know, it's so important to remain hopeful. You know, they wanted to take my colon out, you know, when I was a teenager, and I refused, and thank God I did, because, you know, here I am, and also on the same mission as you know, on a very similar, on a parallel path, to really spread, you know, awareness behind your work, and the real cause and the real treatment then for these conditions, because it just, I get so angry some days. I get so angry and so upset and emotional about this, because I just cannot believe that the medical community and the scientific community and the, you know, the dairy industry, and who's connected to the politicians who, and they're all aware of it. It's some days it's overwhelming to think that the world we live in is such a world that is unwilling to get out of their box and acknowledge something different. And you know,
And I think that it's important to state that it's our world. It's not their world, it's our world. So we have the possibility of changing it. Elected to me is that we have the paper on Crohn's tissue coming out in 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks time. That paper will enable patients to go along to their gastroenterologist if they have had tissue excised and resections or anything like that, and say, I want you to go back to my archived tissue, and I want you to look at that tissue and see if those organisms are there. And so that's what I mean by the patient involvement, that the patient has a role in this to push the change, the same as the researchers do.
yeah.
So there would be an ability to personalize the medicine and to say that organism is in my tissue.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can't wait. You know, please, I update me and send me any of your work that gets published, so that I can share it on my website and with my community. You know, I would really love that. I'm excited.
Absolutely.
And I'm just so, once again,
yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. So grateful for you doing this interview, John, and taking all this time out of your day. You know, I know in New Zealand, you're just starting your day, you know, getting to the lab at 9 a.m. and it's evening here. So I really appreciate the time, and you know, we're in this together, I feel like, you know, and
That's right.
I've wanted to make your acquaintance for years now, and so happy I did. And like I said, maybe I'll get to meet you eventually at the annual conference in the MAP conference in Berkeley. And
I would hope so.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much for your time and for your good questions.
Yeah, thank you, John. Enjoy the rest of your day. Okay, bye-bye.